right, like to call the Village of Cottage Grove meeting to order. It's a budget review meeting held on September 11th at 5:31 p.m. on my watch. This meeting is being held as a hybrid meeting, meaning that we are in the Village Hall as well as on Zoom. The Zoom link is at the top of the agenda, and the agenda was properly posted, and we do have a quorum. So with that, we can move right down to public appearances. So nobody in the room, anybody on Zoom who would like to speak? If you do wish to like to speak, then we ask that you share your name, your address, your municipality, and hold your comments to no more than 3 minutes in case we have multiple people who would like to speak. That's what I figured, but I have to say it anyway. Thank you. All right, then we'll move right to discuss and consider our meeting minutes for the Budget Review Committee held on November 10th, 2022. Any questions, comments, edits regarding the meeting minutes as presented?
Make a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second then.
Is the adjournment correct?
I corrected that
Okay.
afterwards, so yep, it's been
Okay.
corrected.
Then I don't have any other comments.
Okay. Thank you, Cindy. Any other discussion? Having heard none, all those in favor then?
Aye.
Aye. Anybody opposed? Anybody abstain? Motion carries. Get into the full-fledged meat of the things. Here we go. We'll review the 2024 Financial Management Plan, discuss and consider the recommendation to the Village Board. And we'll start off with Greg, I think, right? Or do you want to start it?
Actually, kick it
Cameron.
over to Cameron, and he's going to hand it off to Greg.
Okay.
Well, I'll keep it short and sweet. Thanks everybody for making time for the meeting today. Because this body only meets a couple times a year, thought it'd be a good idea to just discuss the roles and responsibilities of this committee. So in the ordinances, it identifies three different function or powers. One is to annually review and recommend updates to the village financial management plan. That's why we are here today. The second one is to annually review the village draft budget and make recommendations to the village board. That will be coming up later. And then finally, review other miscellaneous financial matters of the village as necessary or as requested, which currently we don't have any of those matters to discuss this year. Secondly, I'd like to just kind of talk about where we are in the budget timeline. So this is the first of many meetings to discuss budgets. Over the month of September, various committees will be meeting and discussing what's called the department request for the different levels of funding. At that point, Matt and I will get those requests and condense a budget for this board. And then this board will be asked to submit a recommended budget to the village board in totality. With that said, I will kick it off to Greg.
Great. Good evening. We'll start by just kind of reviewing kind of the objectives of going through this process. So the village completed its first financial management plan several years ago, and every year at this time we kind of present an update to the 5-year projection of the plan, which includes all the levy-supported funds of the village. So your general fund, capital, debt, projected out at a minimum over 5 years. We'll look a little longer on the debt issuance side. It's really, as Cameron stated, kind of intended as a kickoff to your annual budget process to kind of look at budgeting in a multi-year context. As you go through that process that Cameron described, to kind of hone in on your 2024 budget needs, it's helpful to kind of look at where things are trending in a multi-year context, because decisions that you make for your upcoming budget will have subsequent impacts on future fiscal years. So this is intended to provide that general overview of all your levy-supported funds. We'll look at your borrowing capacity on the capital side and your debt service levy, taking into account the current 10-year capital improvement plan for the village. And then we'll look at kind of your ability to maintain services and capital investment under levy limits. So we'll kind of look at all of those aspects this evening. It's always helpful to kind of start where you're at presently with the village's current financial condition. The village currently has a rating with Standard & Poor's. S&P, your rating is AA, which is a very strong rating. We've summarized here some of their comments from their rating report, from the rating call that occurred with S&P earlier this year. They note that your general fund has historically been very stable in terms of operations, with consistent and predictable revenue sources, and your reserves are high compared with expenditures. It doesn't mean that they're too high, it just means that you're in a healthy financial position, which is one of the key factors that all the rating agencies look at, is the village's fund balance in terms of measuring your ability to have sufficient liquidity and to weather financial ups and downs or unexpected events that may occur. They note that the management practices within the village are strong, have good financial policies. The budget process is comprehensive. You do regular monitoring throughout the year, and then they note that you go through this process on an annual basis for long-term financial and capital planning. A comment that they made on the debt profile, which isn't really too uncommon that we see in Wisconsin with the rating agencies. They characterize the debt profile as weak. It's higher compared to when they're looking at national medians, but I say it's not uncommon when we see that in Wisconsin. This is kind of an outproduct of levy limits. Communities are borrowing more than maybe they would have historically prior to levy limits, because debt is exempt from levy limits. So while they noted it is, they do also say that the debt that you have outstanding, you proactively manage by going through this multi-year process, and that your pension liability is well funded through the state retirement plan. So overall, very positive comments from a third party in terms of providing kind of their assessment of the village's overall financial profile. Yeah,
And just wanted to add here with Greg, one of the comments that came out of that presentation, we kind of looked at this from a dollar amount perspective and a percentage amount perspective. So currently, the S&P noted from a percentage standpoint, the percentage of our reserves to our general fund balance is solid. But from a dollar perspective, if something were to go wrong or a budget was significantly to go off track, the dollar amount is not what they deem as significant enough. So it is kind of something that they give us a kind of a demerit on, if you call it that.
Yeah, and that's kind of transitions well into kind of the slide on page 4, which is just where the village has been at, and looking at the village's unassigned and assigned fund balance as a percent of total expenditures. So this is typically a graph that we share with the rating agencies that just kind of show where things have been at historically. The fund balance, since 2017 has been strong, and that's something that they've noted in those reports. But as Cameron mentioned, prior to 2017, when that fund balance, they look at it again as the percentage of your total expenditures. They also look at the gross dollar amount. So going back several years, that gross dollar amount of fund balance they were concerned about, but it's gradually increased and stabilized. But that's, as Cameron said, something that we need to monitor going forward. And that really is kind of illustrated here kind of on this chart. And so this is kind of a worst case scenario, so to speak, is if your expenditures grew, but your assigned and unassigned fund balance in your general fund did not. So essentially, if you ended the year with balanced budgets, or you ended the year with a deficit, that's what would potentially cause your fund balance to remain stable or decrease. So if your expenditures go up but your fund balance doesn't grow, that percentage is going to drop. And so that's something that we're always mindful of, and I know the village staff looks at when they go through their year-end projections to kind of make sure that fund balance is important. And there's lots of factors that the rating agencies look at when they provide their assessment, whether it's financial or economic. But if I had to pick one that they can place the most emphasis on, I would say it's fund balance, because that is something within the village's direct control. A lot of the other factors that they look at in terms of income or other demographic or socioeconomic factors aren't things that the village board can directly control, but the fund balance they can. So it's something to kind of monitor. If your expenses go up, not to see that fund balance correspondingly start to level off or decline.
And I just want to comment here, between 2017 and 2021, financial conditions were were very favorable for the village. So we had an extended period of times where things, at least from a governmental perspective, were very favorable. Currently with the state of inflation and where I anticipate how sticky inflation has been, I know Greg referenced that, this could be a worst case situation. We don't typically budget for a surplus. I would be surprised if we have any significant surplus over the next 5 years, especially over the next 2 to 3 years. And for 2023, we did have an amended budget that had a small spend down of fund balance. Other than that, overall, from a budgetary perspective, I anticipate to be pretty flat. Outside of that, we'll continue to provide the village board updates on where we're planning on ending up.
Next, let's speak about your growth trends in terms of the village's equalized value. So in this chart, we kind of show the history of the village's equalized value for what is called the TID-out value. That's all the value in the village outside of the incremental value in each of your TIP districts. When we look at the tax rate projections for the multi-year plan, those are based on TID-out values. So that's how this information correlates to the long-range trends that we'll look at in a few moments. So on the top half of this chart, you will see how the TID-out value has grown over the past several years. And we kind of look at what that average change has been. So the Department of Revenue breaks down that annual change in equalized value by the amount that's attributable to economic change, what's attributable to new construction within the community. Then there's an other category that consists of, corrections from the prior year or adjustments, and then personal property as well. Then for the projection, which is on the bottom half of this chart, for the 2025 budget, we've shown the impact of the TID-7 closure on the 2025 budget. And then for 2026, based on current projections, that's when we're projecting that TID number 5 will close, and it would impact the budget for 2026. So that large increase in the TID-out incremental value is factored in there as well. And then for the remainder of kind of this 5-year planning period, we're just conservatively projecting about 4% growth in equalized value. So, in terms of the increase from January 1 of 2023 to 2024, or excuse me, 2022 to 2023 in terms of values, there was a large increase in that TID-out value of 17.68%. So statewide, we've been seeing very healthy increases in equalized value over the past couple of years. It's, not uncommon that we've seen communities have increases over 10% for the past couple of years. Whether or not that's going to continue, I think is what everyone's, kind of debating. Certainly have had some strong years of economic growth, but it's, I don't think it's sustainable to think that those trends are going to continue long term. But to counteract that, the village, has some TID closures that could positively impact budgets, certainly next year or the following year with 2025 with TID-7 and possibly again in 2026 with the closure of TID-5. Next, we'll transition into the operational projections and kind of the methodology that we've used both on the revenue side and the expenditure side. First, we'll speak to some of the additional shared revenue that the village will receive this year as a result of the budget bill that passed in the legislature earlier this year. Made the most significant changes to the shared revenue formula in decades in Wisconsin, largely positive in terms of additional shared revenue both in 2024 and in a small increase anticipated in 2025, and then we're projecting that increase at about 2% annually. It'll be tied to increases in the state sales tax in terms of how that revenue distribution will change going forward. So again, a very positive development, a meaningful amount of dollars, available, that the village and other communities in Wisconsin really hasn't seen from intergovernmental aids in many, many years. In terms of transportation aids, we're projecting those to increase at about 4.5% annually. There's a special charge for refuse that's projected to increase 2% annually. And then most of your other non-levy revenue sources, license and permits, various public charges for services are projected to remain relatively flat, which is common with what we see in municipalities throughout Wisconsin, that those non-levy revenue sources outside of some of these intergovernmental aids generally are fairly consistent from year to year. And we also want to be conservative, so we're factoring that in as well. One other comment related to the shared revenue is that there will be additional reporting requirements for all municipalities to the Department of Revenue going forward to demonstrate that you're maintaining levels for law enforcement, fire, and emergency medical services that are equivalent to the previous year. How that's ultimately going to be reported and kind of what that will look like is still to be determined based on guidance in the DOR. But failure to kind of maintain, they call those maintenance of effort, that could result in reductions to your aid by 15% in the following year if you don't satisfy that requirement. So more to come as more information becomes available from the DOR, but there are some stipulations that go hand in hand with the increases in shared revenue that are applicable to all municipalities.
Just to put some context to the additional shared revenue, so in the 2023 budget, shared revenue made up 0.6% of our general fund revenues. As presented in this packet, the shared revenue would represent 3.9% of general fund revenues. To just put it in perspective, I think there's some misunderstanding from other treasurers and board members that I've talked to that this is going to be a save-all budget fix. We're fortunate because of our population increases. We had a bigger increase than most. We went from 40,000 to 226-ish thousand. But it definitely is not a remediation to the current levy limit structure.
Next, we'll focus on the expenditure side of the general fund, the primary operating fund of the village. We do a line item projection of every line item in the village budget by department, but we kind of categorize each line item in these categories, whether it's a commodity, your employee insurance coverages, your other insurance coverages, your general services, and your general wages. And then we assigned an inflation factor to kind of each of those, or appreciation factor, to kind of project some changes in costs going forward. So this is kind of the methodology that we're starting with, that we've kind of reviewed with village staff as a starting point. So again, all the projections are done on a detailed line item basis, but we're going to be looking at things at kind of more of a broader summary level because we want to really focus on long-term trends. You'll have opportunities as you go through your normal budget process to look at things on a department level in more detail, as Cameron described, but we're really kind of focused here on trends overall. So to that end, the chart here on page 9 kind of provides some historical context for general fund revenues broken down by major revenue categories, taxes, intergovernmental aid, license and permits, fines and forfeitures, and so forth. And then your expenditures is broken down by primary reporting requirements of the general government, public safety, public works, human services, culture, recreation, education, conservation development, and then transfers out to other funds. So it kind of show, how that is trending over the next 5 years. So down below in the last line on this chart, you'll see the change in the general fund levy from the prior year. So you can see historically how much that has changed starting from the 2019 budget through 2023, and then how that's projected to change from 2023 to 2024 and so forth throughout this model. So again, this is based off of what we had just summarized in terms of the revenue projections, some growth in your intergovernmental aids, transportation aids, other revenues held flat, and then increases in your major expenditure categories to kind of factor in increasing costs going forward. So this just looks at your operational fund. We'll start layering in the other aspects of your levy, but this is the largest component of your total property tax levy is the general fund. The next component of your levy is the capital projects. The village for many years has maintained a strong financial practice of levying through your property tax levy, providing cash either to build up reserves to pay for some routine smaller capital items. And that's a good practice. That levy for capital, though, is subject to levy limits. So to the extent that you have operational pressures, that could put some restraints in your ability to kind of maintain that capital levy, but we've tried to continue that practice in this model. Some of your other typical vehicle and equipment acquisitions would be financed with debt, but that debt would be restricted to a term of 5 years to more closely align with the useful life of that asset. This is directly related to, levy limit concerns, is that, maybe ideally you likely would try to levy cash for some of these vehicle and equipment items, but that's going to put levy limit pressure on the village. So by issuing debt, it's exempt from levy limits, but not all debt has to be longer term debt. So we're keeping it at 5 years to pay it off relatively quickly. And that isn't largely uncommon. I mean, we see a lot of communities that borrow for some of those larger routine vehicle and equipment acquisitions, but try to pay it off as quickly as practical. And then other major capital projects that were identified in your capital improvement plan, we show as being financed with a term of 20 years. So in terms of the annual equipment and vehicle amounts, we kind of show kind of a summary here kind of by department in terms of what has been identified to be funded in your capital plan. So this was derived from a list that came from staff in terms of your annual equipment and vehicle purchases over a multi-year period. So this is kind of those routine items that we identified that can kind of be covered through some shorter term financing. Just for illustration purposes, some of the financings we combined for years where there were smaller project amounts. Just for borrowing efficiency, we combined them so you could finance a couple years worth of equipment and vehicle acquisitions in 1 year. That can be evaluated annually, as this list will certainly change, but we try to kind of combine amounts when we can see some efficiencies in terms of cutting down on the number of financial and debt transactions that are issued. In terms of the major capital projects, this is a summary from your capital prioritization program that you've kind of implemented with staff this year to kind of prioritize larger capital projects. So the project ID number, comes directly from that planning document in terms of what was identified. So we've got the projects listed here and kind of how they're funded. So we kind of show annual financings for, some of these larger capital projects. This is all debt service that would be supported through the levy for general obligation debt, both existing and proposed debt. So this is just a simple chart that summarizes what was in your capital prioritization document.
The only thing I'll comment, you will note on page 12, there isn't a 2033. There wasn't any projects slated in there. So you're going to see this is a 10-year plan, but only 9 years are shown on that second schedule.
So one of the projects that was identified in the plan and that on the previous chart, that was the municipal services building that was kind of identified for funding in 2026 and 2027. One option that the village has to, finance those types of projects outside of general obligation debt is through the USDA Rural Development Program. The primary reason communities may choose to use this program is because those bonds can be issued under what's called revenue debt, which is not subject to the village's general obligation debt limit. As with any financing options, there's advantages and disadvantages. Some of the areas of concern that we always like to point out anytime a USDA financing is discussed is, first you have to qualify through the application process. This is a good program, but the application process is very detailed, very thorough. It's a bit arduous to kind of walk through it. I always say it's, if you consider this program, it's not for the faint of heart. There's a lot of requirements to go through this. And then there's certain legal steps that have to be followed to utilize this program as well. So I mentioned, you can issue loans to this program on a revenue basis. And the way most communities legally go through that process is that they use their community development authority to do that. Because a community development authority has the ability to issue revenue debt. But a community development authority only has legal borrowing capacity or legal authority to finance projects under two areas. One is if you're acting in the capacity of a housing authority, or two is if you are issuing debt to remediate blight. So if you had a facility that you were going to, finance a municipal building on it, you would legally have to declare that site as blighted in order for the CDA to be able to, legally execute that financing. So that's, there's a statutory process that you have to follow to go through that, but that's a requirement. You can't really implement this financing without kind of doing that blight designation if your CDA is involved. The program requires interim financing, which just means you have to initially raise the capital through some other means, and then their loan program pays off that interim financing and amortizes it, for their remaining term. That term can be as much as 40 years. The biggest area of concern with this form of financing is that it is not exempt from levy limits. So we've been talking about how debt is exempt from levy limits. That's general obligation debt. Revenue debt is not exempt from levy limits. But practically speaking, if you were to finance some kind of a village facility, your revenue stream to repay that debt is going to be your property tax levy. There's really no other practical revenue stream that you can pledge. So what communities that utilize this program have to do annually is that they need to issue a taxable general obligation note that has a term at least of 1 year and a day, so it's considered long-term debt for reporting on your financial statements. That provides you the revenue to pay the USDA loan off, and then by issuing that taxable debt obligation on a GO basis, it's then exempt from levy limits. So it has to be taxable debt because you can't issue tax-exempt debt to pay another debt obligation. And you have to go through this process every year. So there's a big administrative commitment to doing this. If your loan's outstanding for 40 years, you're going to have to do this for 40 years. So it's something we want to make sure, these are all points we tell any community that considers this type of financing, because it's, again, it's something that, you need to know of going in. So you have to go through this annual process to kind of have an exemption for levy limits. The main advantage is it doesn't count towards your GO debt limit. That's why communities use this program. You can have a longer term, which is up to 40 years. It's prepayable. The longer term can keep your debt service costs down, but you also have to take into account the life of the asset that you're financing. If you're financing any kind of a building over 40 years, it's strong likelihood you're going to need significant investment back in that building before that 40-year term is up. So, are you going to have debt outstanding for the building when you haven't already paid off the original debt? And then again, it can be issued through a community development authority. So I mean, that's kind of the process to kind of go through this. We're going to look at kind of the fiscal impact, but these are kind of the pros and cons of this financing option, which are a little more nuanced than your standard general obligation debt. So if we kind of took that full amount of the kind of project cost for the municipal services building as it stands now in your capital improvement plan, kind of the bulk of it funded over a 2-year period of around $35 million, that's even with a 40-year amortization, that's a significant impact to the debt, to the levy, the debt service levy, and your levy overall. So I think we show that here on this chart. I mean, you're looking at a potential levy increase of almost 1.8 million, kind of once you kind of level out the payments, and that's even over 40 years. So I think in conversations, with this about staff, I think the main takeaway is that there likely just needs to be some additional phasing for this type of a project. That dollar amount, regardless of what it would be for, is just a large amount of, to take on at a particular time. So that levy impact is significant, even with a 40-year amortization. Some phasing can lessen that impact. Understand your facility study is, in the process of being updated. Once that information becomes available, we can look at some alternative proposals, look at revisions to your CIP and make those adjustments accordingly. So I think there's more to come on this, but just kind of taking things and kind of how they're slotted now, even with a longer amortization period, that's a large capital amount to kind of take on in a fairly short duration of time.
I think one thing to note is, and we have to see the study yet, but what's most likely is that we're not talking about, it will be phasing, but we're talking about probably addressing one department, like the PD. That's about all that we're gonna be able to absorb in this 10-year window. Maybe a smaller phase on the back end of the 10 years, and then looking at the next 10 years at Public Works, and then so on and so forth from there. So, yeah, that's pretty much where things are at. And when you see some of the construction figures, you'll see what I mean, because we probably can't even fully address all of the PD's needs in one fell swoop. That might even have to be phased for one department. So, yeah.
Can I ask a question
Sure.
about phasing? So, I mean, how does that lessen the fiscal impact? Like, if you spread it out over, over decades, or like, how does it overlap to reduce fiscal impact?
It's just making it a little more manageable. When you're borrowing $35 million, a kind of one large chunk. That's just a large dollar amount to try to absorb into a budget. So by spreading it out and phasing it and layering it in, you can just make that budgetary impact, that levy impact, a little bit less by just not having 35 million hit your budget all at once. That's, as I said, regardless of what it would be for. 35 million, that's just a lot to absorb in a short period of time.
Greg, any idea what that would mean for the average taxpayer? 35 million 1 year for the next 20 years?
I think we're talking like $500 or $600 a year. The 40-year borrowing is absolutely something I would never recommend.
Yeah. That's why I said 20.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So maybe we do a $3 to $6 million improvement within the scope of this plan. Years 10 through 15, we do another. It's just, we have to be really cognizant of what the taxpayer impact is. There's some immediate needs from a PD and Public Works perspective that we'll try to likely address first. But as Greg mentioned, and what the slide mentions, we'll do kind of an additional mini prioritization of what our facility needs are, and hopefully we'll have a implementable plan with the FGM study. But this, and frankly, we're not gonna take care of all of our needs in the next 20 years. It's just the economic climate that we're in.
John, probably about $1,000 for the average home.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And that's on
For just
that. And then it's anything else on top of that, operations or otherwise, the 3 to 5%. People be screaming.
And that's on a $315,000 house.
Yeah.
So just not feasible.
So next, we'll kind of transition into the long-term debt model. We kind of start with just the summary of your existing levy for general obligation debt. So the village has, total principal and interest payments that are due each year. That's summarized on the far left-hand side of this chart. And then the village uses some non-levy revenue sources to cover some of that existing general obligation debt, some revenue from the water and sewer utilities, and then increment from TIDS 5, TIDS 6, and TIDS 7. And then there's some modest investment income that's budgeted each year as well. So your levy for debt service, just for existing debt for the 2024 budget, will be approximately $1,311,025 So we show how that levy will change going forward before we look at the impact of adding in all the projects identified in your capital improvement plan. But this is kind of our starting point to kind of see the impact of your existing debt. So then if we add in all the estimated debt service, this is for everything that we talked about in the capital plan. So borrowings for your vehicle and equipment that's amortized over a 5-year basis, and then 20-year financings for all the projects that were identified on the prioritization list, with the exception of the municipal services building that's excluded from this analysis. So we'll see, from 2024 to 2025, the levy increase for debt only is about $548,000, and would increase another roughly $500,000 in 2026, and then it starts to level off by about a $312,000 increase, through the planning period. So the debt service starts to decline in 2034. That's really taking into account that that's kind of when our capital model ends. So we've built in, some room for additional projects beyond that point. But this is, just on the debt service side, if everything that was identified, was funded, this is just what the levy increase would be per year, just for debt service. In terms of what that would look like and for the village's general obligation borrowing capacity, at the end of this fiscal year, 2023, the village will be at about 38% of its debt limit, leaving about $38.5 million of borrowing capacity. With funding of everything, excluding the municipal building, shows that debt capacity utilization, remains under 40%, during the planning period in this model. So I know there's been a lot of effort put forth by village board and village staff, over the course of the past year to kind of go through that prioritization process. And then staff has taken that direction to kind of identify, borrowing amounts that are reflected here in this plan. And this, I think is a much more reasonable level to kind of be at for the village. You're remaining, under 50% of your borrowing capacity, which is ideal. I know last year when we were presenting multiple scenarios and different borrowing levels, we were getting up to as high as, 75% of your geodebt utilization, which is the maximum amount we want you to see at, but that we're not recommending you get to that level at all. I think this is more reasonable. So certainly as you look at, phasing in some of the, of the other projects, or maybe the municipal building project, this is a much better starting point to start look at doing that from, debt capacity utilization of just under 40%. So, I want to commend you all for getting to this point, because from my perspective, where we were a year ago to where we're at now, I mean, I think this is far more realistic in terms of kind of giving you a threshold to move forward with your capital priorities, and then also consider maybe some other larger needs, that may need to be addressed as well. So this is kind of the big roll-up, kind of where everything we've been discussing up until this point, what that looks like. So how's the total property tax levy, projected to change, over the next 5 years. So you have, your 3 components of your levy: your general fund levy, which is your main operations; your capital levy, which is providing that funding for some cash financing or building up reserves for some of your capital items. You've got your levy for existing debt, and then you have your due debt that would be added in for the capital improvement plan. So that total change in the levy from 23 to 24 is estimated about 14%, then it's at about 13% in 25, and then starts to kind of level off from 26 to 28. So we show, the taxes on $100,000 value on an assessed basis and $100,000 of value on an equalized or market value basis. And then we show kind of that change in equalized value that we discussed earlier. The 2024 budget, seeing seeing the benefit of in the next couple of years of some TID closures, and then kind of starting to level off in 27 and 28. So the TID closures affect budget years 25 and 26. And then we just break down the total tax rate, by each particular fund. General fund, your capital tax rate, existing debt, and new debt service. So from a levy limit perspective, this kind of coincides with what Cameron was mentioning earlier. Certainly the increases that you're seeing in shared revenue, starting with the 2024 budget, and then, hopefully seeing some increases in that going forward is certainly, kind of buying some time in terms of there being any kind of a levy limit gap. We're not projecting a levy limit gap until fiscal year 2027, kind of under all of this methodology. So it's certainly helping in terms of kind of addressing some of those fiscal pressures that you've all been dealing with for a couple of years as you've been growing, but yet also have to, remain diligent with levy limits, but provide services that meet expectations of village residents. It's buying some time in terms of that levy limit gap, but by 2027, that projected levy limit gap's about $620,000. Then it increases, to over $900,000 in 2028. Kind of illustrates what Cameron was mentioning, that it provides some relief and provides some time to kind of proceed, but it's not solving any completely financial problem or challenges over the next 5-year period. So improvement over where we were looking at things a year ago, certainly, but still long-term challenges kind of remain in terms of maintaining existing service levels under levy limits.
So what those gaps mean is that if they're still there as we approach in 27, we either need to reduce our levy by we need to cut by 600,000, or we need to go to referendum to exceed. And in this case, you would likely by then we'd have some projections to see beyond 28 even, but you'd probably be asking somewhere close to $1 million to exceed, so you're able to continue that threshold going forward. The goal going forward is to these numbers are generally are less and further out by 1 year than they were last year. So hopefully we can keep doing that. Certainly we don't want to see them come sooner or get larger.
And when you do levy limit referendums, just kind of the general requirements that you have to meet is first you have to specify what the levy limit increase is for. So that could be for a particular department or departments, or it could be more broadly based. And then you have to specify is it a 1-year increase? Is it for a specified number of years, or is it essentially ongoing? And so how that works under a levy limit referendum is that, if you have a dollar amount approved, you can claim that on the levy limit worksheet to increase your allowable levy. If it was ongoing, you could claim that amount potentially every year. And, it's base building going forward. It doesn't get subtracted out. So it's usually anytime a community does a levy limit referendum and they're looking at making adjustments to increase their allowable levy beyond net new construction, that referendum amount is what you would always claim first, because it gives you the most financial flexibility. So those are kind of the policy decisions that have to be made if you consider a levy limit referendum. And then just understanding the timing, what time of year you want to have it to give you enough time to be adequately prepared for the budget process. So just using this as an illustration, if in 2027 you're going to experience a levy limit gap, it might be advantageous to do a levy limit referendum in the spring or late summer, depending on the election cycle, so you had that direction before you were starting your budget process. You wouldn't want to have well, you could, but I wouldn't recommend you to have like a levy limit referendum in November. It would, you'd have to have like 2 budgets prepared simultaneously, and communities have done that and lived to regret it. So that's just kind of where that shakes out.
I guess I want to emphasize, referendum is the last resource that we would utilize. There's a couple other things we can do. Certainly, there's a utility called a transportation utility. We can create a stormwater utility, but I think just the key message here is you can call it a utility or call it a user fee. It's still a tax in the end of the day. So we still have to come up and reduce the shortfall while also making sure that the tax impact year over year is reasonable for our residents. So basically, as we're going into the budget season, I've kind of asked every department to kind of think about, okay, well, what can we do? Are there things that we can do to be more efficient, to reduce future costs, to automate, to hopefully start to make the 2027, 2028 shortfall better. But it will be a challenge here, and I will be providing updates as we get closer to those dates.
I just had one question. So the shortfall still maintains our reserves where they should be, that 20 to 30% reserves? Or is it a spend down of our reserves plus the shortfall?
So that doesn't, that 600,000 or 620 and 27, we could use reserves for that. Ultimately, I would recommend making significant cut. But it's ultimately up to the board to decide what to do. If we would use that full balance to balance the budget, we're talking about potentially not even being able to issue debt on the bond market.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that wasn't it wasn't both things combined. It was maintaining that balance and then, okay, thanks.
Yeah, that wouldn't be a sustainable
No.
source either. So that would help you for 1 year, and then you would still have a shortfall the next year, so.
Yeah.
And one quick question also. So if the shortfall is scheduled to happen in 2027, we'd need to do the referendum in 2026, yes?
Yes, 2026,
Okay.
most ideally, so.
Thank you.
So we just graphically represent kind of the trend in property tax levies shown in the orange bars, and then kind of the equalized tax rate that's kind of shown per thousand. Kind of the drop, again, is really directly related to TID closures. That's kind of what's driving that change in the tax rate. So we've talked about levy limits. Again, just to reiterate, your 3 components of the levy: general fund, capital, and debt service. Your general fund, operational levy. Your capital levy is subject to levy limits. Your general obligation debt service is not subject to levy limits. So this is just the levy limit projection. I'm not going to bore you by going through the detailed calculations of the levy limit worksheet, but really kind of at the bottom is kind of just what we were referencing on the prior summary chart. It just shows what your actual or projected levy would be and how that compares, to your allowable, your actual levy, and just kind of where that gap kind of exists. So, again, shows that you're kind of projecting to have that gap in 2027 and 2028. The only other comments I'll just kind of make about levy limits in general is that the year following a TID closure, you do get a one-time levy limit adjustment. That's, you take the incremental value of the TID district, divide it by the TID out equalized value at the time of closure, and cut that percentage in half, 50%. So using TID 5 as an example, your larger TID, if that impacted your 2026 budget, we're projecting that would give you a levy limit increase of about 8.53%, or in real dollars, that would give you about an additional $236,000. So you do see some benefit. There's, there's no reason you shouldn't take advantage of that, because if you don't, you'll just lose out on it. So we do factor that into this analysis. So that's beneficial, but is not getting us over the hump in terms of that projected gap in future years.
And our new construction is certainly helping us out. If you look in the middle of the slide there, the net new construction, the 23, 24 column at 7, a little over 7%. That's the second highest increase in Dane County. Windsor was a little ahead of us there. But what's worth noting is while that is significant and great, it helps our bottom line by $183,000. So it basically will probably not even break even on adding 2 police officers, because you're growing, and it's like you just basically tread water, which is a better place to be than some other municipalities that aren't growing,
Right.
that are literally having negative net new constructions.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, there's communities that have, I call it decimal dust in terms of net new construction, 0.0 something, which, is
So
useless.
we've been seeing the extent of levy limits have really started to impact municipalities. For the longest time, you'd see school districts would go for operational referendums, and a lot of people in the municipal world always kind of like, I wouldn't say rolled their eyes, but we're just like almost like, geez, that's never gonna, we would never want to go ask for an operational referendum. And the last few years, you've been seeing, it started off with like 5, and then there were 10, and last year I think there were 15 or 20, and you're just going to see more and more. So the good news is by the time we get to 2026, it'll be more common, so we won't be looked upon hopefully unfavorably that way. But you still want to make sure it's right-sized and tied to, hopefully public safety or something like that. Those tend to pass at a higher rate than others. So, yeah, and then the key is to hopefully not have the tax impact be too stark. It seems like if you're getting close to 500, I don't have the stats on it, but the kind of breaking point seems to be around $500 for the average home is when you see things get denied.
Yeah, I just want to put our net new construction in the 183,000 in context. So that is about approximately 3% of our general fund budgeted expenditures or revenues. And as I'm sure everybody has noticed, groceries compared to today, compared to last year at this time, and compared to 2 years at a time, we're talking well over 7 to 10% increases. And we're not immune to it. Governments, it typically hits a little bit later than consumers. So we haven't even began to feel the full effects of what inflation levels are. And it's a primary concern of mine for this upcoming budget.
Can I ask quick, the 2026 increase on net new construction, can you just remind me why we're projecting 19% net new?
Yeah, Amazon.
Amazon, thank you.
So just in terms of kind of some conclusions of what we've been discussing. So on the debt side, the village remains under 40% of its geo debt limit. That's exclusive of any, large facility improvements. But as I stated, a much better starting point in terms of looking at your other core infrastructure and capital needs in terms of, leaving you at, a very healthy spot to kind of fund those and potentially look at other areas as needed. Your average levy increase per year over the 5-year planning period is about 10%, higher in the next couple of years. And then as we've been discussing, you're projected in this model to have your allowable levy under levy limits by 2027, exceed that amount, and then that gap starts to increase thereafter. So, I think you're seeing the benefit of the increase from the shared revenue. But, agree with Cameron's comments in the introduction, and I'm seeing this a lot in other communities around the state. It's kind of delaying maybe some of those other, solutions, such as, certainly cuts or, looking at levy limit referendums. It's kind of helping bridge that gap, but I mean, it's not the solution in a lot of places. Not to minimize its impact, it's very helpful, and as I said, this is the most sweeping positive change in intergovernmental revenue in decades. So it's helpful, but it's those increases aren't projected to be keeping up with your increases in costs. So that's kind of the summary of the financial management plan. Cameron, I don't know if you have anything further you wanted to add, I'll take Matt's absence as he was thrilled and just left the room.
Thanks, Craig. I think we can turn it over to the committee for comments, questions.
Any questions from the committee members, in addition to the ones who already asked? So just to clarify, Greg, the plan put forth now, just essentially, we do very little or nothing to address our facility structures as they see fit right now. We've pulled that out, correct?
That's correct, and that was just based off of, again, kind of how it was slotted in the plan now, kind of the entire, full scope of the project kind of being constructed, over a 2-year period or likely funded in a narrow window of time. We did start with that scenario, and I mean, it just was coming back with impacts that were just, I think beyond what I think we would assume you would find politically tolerable, so we kind of scaled it back. And
Let alone that's not even, I mean, that's probably the cost for just the PD, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like that, we're talking, like, again, we don't have the study, but I mean, to do everything, I mean, it's $50, $60 million.
So what we'll do then, and to address this issue, and I'll put air quotes, address this issue, is we'll essentially kind of Band-Aid it and address the immediate needs and then add a few million here or there, correct? That's kind of the plan.
I think, board members need to determine what they're personally comfortable with on a tax impact perspective, and we got to see what the recommendations are from FGM and what would be recommended from the PD side, and address that at the highest amount that is tolerable.
Yeah.
Which could be, I don't know, 8 to 12 million, something like that.
And there's a combination in here. There's likely in the plan, the 10-year plan, and again, this is just guidelines over the next 10 years. Expect changes as more information comes to light. Projects may come in and out depending on the phasing that needs to be done. If we need to take a $5 million chunk, we might have to cut an existing $2 or $3 million project.
Right.
That's in the plan. So that's to come. Another thing that I guess maybe gets lost, we do remain under the 40% in the GO debt limit, but as you guys can see, the equalized value has increased. 40% of what we are at today compared to 40% that we were at 5 years ago, the tax impact is significantly more now than it used to be, until kind of it catches up a little bit. So just wanted to make sure, the goal isn't to maintain a certain percentage, but to look at it holistically and look at the tax impact.
I have a quick clarifying question. So on page 12 or slide 12 is listed the major capital projects. Do I understand right that all of them were included except for number 21?
that is correct.
And what about the ladder 1 replacement?
That was included as well.
It is
So that was the reason that doesn't have an identification number associated with it, is that, and this wasn't a problem, when staff provided the list of kind of the equipment and vehicles that were being financed over a 5-year period, that project was on that list. That's that's not something you have to necessarily amortize over 5 years, so I took it from that list and added it to this list, so it was incorporated into a 20-year borrowing.
Okay.
So that's why there's no ID number and why it's listed separately. It was just, I wanted to keep this consistent with the planning document, but that was one change that I decided to make the financial plan a little more palpable.
And in the survey process, that was the very last question. Obviously, if we're tentatively earmarking $1 million in equipment for fire, EMS, and ourselves, a $2 million per ladder truck, we're not going to be able to fund. So that's essentially being able to, if you would have kept it in the vehicle fund, it's not doing anything else and then doing the ladder truck over 2 years, or pulling that out and considering that essentially a major asset, which makes more sense from an amortization perspective. And then Greg.
And fire
took it to
trucks
this
are
page.
bondable.
That's correct. That's correct.
I had another question about the major capital projects. So this is what Strand like estimated for these projects. So we could like now, once we pass the FMP, then start to look at grants because they're like to improve safety of transportation areas or water quality or like, then they'll be able to kind of know that these are more set. I mean, I know nothing's set until the year you actually approve it, but they could start to look for those funding opportunities.
Yep, and just to keep in mind, so this is the best information we had available to estimate what these projects cost. Now, what I will instruct staff to do for 2024 and 2025 projects, to work with Strand, to work with other funding we can get, and really hone in on these true project costs. I think as everyone last year with the Bakken Park improvements went from the initial amount to what it ended up being, I want to bring that forward into the actual budget process and have, you know, kind of the a la carte option. This is what would happen if you do everything, and this is what the bare minimum scope of the project, and ultimately have the board to make that decision.
And so maybe to that point, Cameron, when we look at our prioritization that we did, and we looked at it at the last board meeting, the one through 21, I mean, that was our scores A through C, right? I mean, that included when I look at our prioritization summary, I mean, I guess what I'm wondering is, what would this financial plan look like if we only included things that graded A and B? Am I understanding it right?
That's difficult to an extent where would I be using an aggregate score or?
Oh, okay. I was looking at the
Yeah.
aggregate score.
Yeah, so you know, if you did, and what's challenging with a 10-year schedule and grading it is, for example, there's the business park improvements, but we're not recommend, even if it was scored an A or a B, we wouldn't recommend that it's due next year because of the state of the infrastructure. Based off of where the asphalt is and the TID closure, that's kind of what we recommended for a year. So it's kind of a balancing act between the score of the project and then placing it, okay, are there any efficiencies with lining it up with road maintenance that we have scheduled, and kind of strategically looking at it all together. So that's where I think you will see some kind of things where it's like, oh, well, this was a C, why is this in 2024, and a project in 2025, and et cetera.
Yeah, I understand that. I think where I'm, having pulled out the 35 million for the municipal services building, that scored really high on the priority list. And so I guess I'm just worried about us putting a whole financial plan together that doesn't include any of the facilities considerations.
And that's why my recommendation would be because we have capacity, and as Greg showed we're well under 40%, once we get the study done, the board would get okay, this is what we would recommend to addressing some of the phasing. I think what was most important is the short term. We know even if we signed a contract for 25 million, 30 million, it's 2 to 3 years before we actually see the result. So there's some things that we have to do today to start accommodating for expected needs next year. You know, you all drove here today. The parking lot is in desperate need of repair out here. Not a fun repair, but something that's gonna, if this building is expected to last 5-10 years, something we have to put on the schedule. PD is out of locker room space. Bonnie Road basically needs to be raised. So that short-term pot of money, JJ during the budget process will propose what that actually looks like from a piece perspective. And so to your point, I think that's a good idea, that we'll have the study and then be able to kind of present a plan. And really, with the way the plan is structured, anything outside of 2024 and 2025 has a lot of flexibility, but anything that you're looking at for 2024 and 2025, we're gonna start to incur engineering costs to research the plan, implement the plan. After that, that's just the best information we have available at this time.
Okay.
So Sarah, this would basically be an interim plan approval for the capital projects that are longer term. So this would just keep the budget process moving forward, and then once FGM is done, they'll present, and then they would connect with Cameron and Greg and I, and we would look at what they're presenting and say, no way, that's not even close, and what's more feasible, and then we come back with some recommendations and see what fits and where
Okay.
at a later date. So
But that wouldn't impact, we would move forward, approve this financial management plan, this would be the plan we would use. And then next year at this time, maybe is when we'd be incorporating,
potentially, I would say maybe even later in Q4 this year.
okay.
Yeah.
So kind of on that, I guess, what we need to figure out then is what is the budget impact or the tax impact that we think might be absorbable and acceptable? You know, $300 per year for the average homeowner. I'm just throwing that, I have no idea what number I would come up with. And then work with you backward on like how much then we could spend on facilities to match that tax impact. Is that something we can, I don't know.
No, exactly. So I think, back to the chart on page 19 that kind of had the future levy and tax rate, impacts. I mean, this just kind of shows where things are trending without, the building project. So, I mean, it's from there taking, this is what that looks like. If we start layering in some additional costs for the building, where's that threshold that, that it's, beyond what, may be politically acceptable in terms of the fiscal impact. So I think we've got everything kind of framed out. It's just then layering in the municipal building project.
Other questions?
These are all 2023 numbers going out to 2032. There's no escalation attached to them.
Yeah, the 23 numbers for operations goes out through 2028. The debt
I'm
goes.
just talking about the major capital projects. Those are today's dollars.
Yes.
What you put on, yeah.
Well, not if they're projected out. I mean, they're
Well, they're based on the
Okay.
best estimate available
Of what you think it
today,
would be in
so,
2030.
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
just wanted to know.
Good question. Any other questions, comments? Otherwise, let's discuss, consider.
I'll make a motion that we recommend the financial management plan as presented here tonight to the board.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second then. Any further discussion? Having heard none, all those in favor then?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Any abstain? Motion carries. All right. Moving then to item 6.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Non-debatable. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thanks, everybody.